The title of a classic film refers to a piece of cinema that has had such an impact on culture or received so much universal praise that it's impossible to deny its quality. The roster is extensive from Citizen Kane to The Godfather, Titanic to Indiana Jones, or modern examples like Mad Max Fury Road or The Wolf of Wall Street. There's even the concept of a film reappraisal where a hated or mildly discarded film in the years following can be reevaluated to be a masterpiece, or classic in disguise like Blade Runner, Heaven's Gate, or the collective work of John Carpenter. But is it possible that films can eventually lose that status? Be revoked of the notion that they are classics because they no longer hold relevance, or are reappraised to where issues are found? I want to discuss this using a film often regarded as the greatest horror film of all time, The Exorcist. This is a personally strange criticism to make as I'm a horror filmmaker, horror buff, and absolutely love horror films that emerged from the 70s. What right do I have to criticize a universally beloved horror film that was nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars while winning 2 others and been such an integral part of pop culture? Well, aside from the Oscars not always picking lasting films, anyone remember Crash, Spotlight, or The English Patient? And pop culture relevance does not determine quality. Shrek and the Cat in the Hat films have been thoroughly exploited for meme humor online more than The Exorcist in recent years. That doesn't make them retroactive masterpieces. Most of The Exorcist's legacy is on its iconography and choice lines that were absorbed by the cultural zeitgeist to where one could experience the film through cultural osmosis without having seen it. The exposure a piece of media has does not determine its overall value. Like I said, The Exorcist has lost a lot of relevance even in the horror community, but is still made to be a gold standard of horror films alongside The Shining, Alien, Halloween, Jaws, Scream, The Descent, and half a dozen other films. Before I do a deep dive onto why I think The Exorcist should be re-examined, I want to look at some other examples first. One of the best arguments for why it should be okay for films to lose their classic status is Gone with the Wind. The epic 1939 film based off the novel of the same name is so thoroughly absorbed by American culture and cinema that it's considered a benchmark in box office success and cinematic scope. But an obvious problem that has always existed within the film is the sympathetic portrayal of the Southern Confederacy during the American Civil War. People will try to argue that this discussion is only a recent controversy, but this has been an issue with groups long before the invention of the internet. The Confederacy did not exist purely for old-fashioned Southern way of living. That's an exaggerated right-wing lie. The Confederacy existed purely to exploit black lives as slave labor for their entire economy, where whites would not have to work, but profit exponentially. On top of the film's heroic and sympathetic depiction of the Confederacy is the obvious racist caricatures of black characters and the depiction of marital rape. Now, it's impossible to remove the long-standing impact Gone with the Wind has had on culture, and especially American culture. But the question stands, why does this film still need to be regarded as a masterpiece or one of the most important films ever made? I'm not calling for the film to be censored, removed, or banned, but does it still need to be regarded as a classic? Does a film that depicts an unrealistic reality of American history and violence against married women still deserve to be called an American classic simply because it's big, beautiful, and made a lot of money? To go into a much easier film to discuss in terms of why the film shouldn't be praised is Triumph of the Will, the 1935 Nazi propaganda film. Now, Folding Ideas did a much more in-depth look of the film, so I do recommend checking that video as well, link in the description. But I will be going over broad strokes. Triumph of the Will is a film that makes the Nazi Party look like a stable, functional part of the German nation and promotes the messages and iconography of the party. The film even promotes their own military over the much larger standard German army as a way to manipulate people on who the superior group is. A film that promotes the Nazis and their hateful beliefs based on eugenics is bad enough, but Triumph of the Will is still promoted in some schools of cinema as an important technical piece of drama. It is not. Triumph of the Will did not invent cinematic techniques. In reality, Hitler gave the director enough money to make a giant and expensive-looking film that combined all the techniques previously established in film together. It's not a success of artistry or inventing cinema. It's a success of a budget, which was given by the state. You might ask, why is this film still taught then? Unfortunately, Nazi sympathizers after enduring the Nazi regime kept trying to promote Nazi media and culture as important or even superior to other artistic creators. Considering Hitler was an artist, this wouldn't be a surprise that he'd want to promote and relish in his party's film being seen as successful artistic creations. So due to fascist sympathizers constantly pushing the film for examination and praise meant that the film will likely still pop up in film studies classroom to promote the filmmaking, but that filmmaking only exists to push for the Nazi agenda. It's a weird caveat that the filmmaking of Triumph of the Will be looked at, while trying to separate the intent of that filmmaking. So again, why is this film not regarded as a propaganda film with stolen techniques that promotes a toxic ideology? Why is it that we need to validate the techniques of this film? Going back to America, a similar discussion should be had about Birth of a Nation, the 1915 D.W. Griffith film that proudly promotes the KKK and their murder of African Americans. This film was a box office hit, founded the concept of the American epic, and in 1992 was selected for preservation by the Library of Congress. The film was heavily protested in its day with calls for censorship, to the point D.W. Griffith made a response to that call for censorship with intolerance, stating in interviews that people were intolerant for hating his hateful film and believed he had nothing to apologize for. Now, I don't want film to be erased. Those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. But this film was also considered to be an important film in the development of American cinema, and critics still consider D.W. Griffith one of the founding fathers of cinema. Why should a film clearly promoting a domestic terrorist group and where the filmmaker believes people were intolerant for not supporting him deserve to still be regarded as a film so important that it deserves preservation? It should not be forgotten, but it does not deserve a positive legacy. A controversial figure in terms of films and politics is Clint Eastwood with American Sniper, being a film that got American audiences in seats, but ultimately had no lasting impact and I find to be a lacking piece of cinema. But going back to the 70s and Clint Eastwood's director career, two of his classic westerns I recently watched rubbed me up the wrong way. Clint has undoubtedly created some great films in Play Misty for Me, Unforgiven, A Perfect World, and Mystic River, but High Plains Drifter and The Outlaw Josie Wales are two critically acclaimed works that I thoroughly believe do not deserve it. High Plains Drifter has Eastwood's anti-hero protagonist rape a woman in the first 10 minutes, and the film still argues for you to root for him. And The Outlaw Josie Wales is a revisionist piece of historical Western fiction that frames the Confederate South as good, the Union North as murderers, and this is given greater context when the book's Josie Wales that was based on was written by a KKK leader. Once again, why does The Outlaw Josie Wales deserve to be in the Library of Congress for preservation? I know I'm going over these works in broad strokes before getting into the meat of this video, but I want to turn it to you. Is there a film you've watched that is considered a classic or culturally important that upon watching you find distasteful and feel like it doesn't deserve that? The last film I want to get into is The Red Shoes, the 1948 drama that many still regard as a high point in cinema. The film is beautiful, well acted, and the titular scene of the Red Shoes performance is undoubtedly the highlight of the film. But there was something that bothered me about the film. Its narrative is tied to the main character Victoria as she is torn between a career and family life. However, this is framed by Victoria needing to choose between two men, one who can give her a successful career and one who can give her a happy family. At the climax, she cannot decide and commits suicide by train. The Red Shoes narrative, tragedy or not, says that if a woman who cannot decide between two men, she should die. It's clearly a sign of the era, similar to how the 2019 Little Women film openly says a woman should find love or die from the perspective of an older publisher who is in the wrong. But still, classic film or not, the narrative can sting of a toxic message. Similar to how William Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew was considered such a toxic representation of love that contemporary playwrights criticized the work. It's always important to read what a film is saying, regardless of intent and regardless of the time it was produced. I have tried to love The Exorcist. I've watched it more than a dozen times and watched it again in full before starting the script, but I've never found it scary. The editing has always been a point of contention with me, and after reading what the film appears to be saying, I see The Exorcist as a piece of anti-countercultural horror that is aggressively trying to convince the audience to re-establish their faith in the Catholic Christian faith. Now, this is not a discussion on faith versus non-faith. It's a discussion of what the film says through its framing and characters. Here's a question. Why does the Demon King Pazuzu possess Reagan? In most haunting, possession, or similar genre stories, there's usually a purpose between the location, the family history, or sacred item or a cult targeting them. In The Exorcist, there isn't any real motive. So why would a Demon King possess the daughter of a successful single actress who is acting in a film that supports students protesting the military? And that's when I started to look into the film more. If you're a fan of The Exorcist and do need some love for the film, I recommend watching Ryan Hollinger's video on the film in the description below, as his videos are genuinely great, even if I don't agree with some, because I'm mostly going to rip the film apart in making my thesis and evidence. I will say that the film has an immensely powerful tone and atmosphere. The cinematography and imagery perfectly captures art house images and realistic settings, and the acting is great. But at the end of the day, horror films either need to scare or have something to say. The Exorcist didn't scare me, and so I went digging into the film's framing and characters to see. For context, The Exorcist came out the same year the US exited the Vietnam War, and the 70s was considered a celebrational of countercultural movements in the 60s. Anti-war protesters, anti-establishment, anti-racist, and second-wave feminism were all prominent in the 60s, and so the 70s was that countercultural group celebrating what they had done. Obviously, America had not completely given into these movements. Even today, anti-war and anti-racist movements are considered extreme countercultural movement by some communities in America. The film's mechanics of having the daughter of an actress starring in an anti-war film being possessed by a demon feels more like a punishment for having countercultural actions and beliefs. The director of the film she's working on and her friend is depicted as a drunk who randomly decides to berate and accuse someone of being a Nazi without predication and is murdered not too long after. Other particular notes in the film that ring interesting is an astronaut told he's going to die up there, and the doctors who try to help Reagan during this film are shown to be uncaring, incompetent, or clueless. Even the film depicts the real medical procedures as terrifying as it does the demonic segments of the film. The film really does give this heavy feeling wherein those who have not subscribed to faith, have belief in the medical industry, or have absorbed any elements of 1960s countercultural behaviors are in the wrong. The film has a particularly dark use of the female characters. Damien's elderly mother who dies is still used as an emotional tool against by the demon. Reagan suffers horrific and near fetishist levels of suffering. Her mother is bruised and reduced to screaming often, and it may interest you to learn that both the audible and visual representations of Pazuzu are women themselves. Before I go any further, I want to have a discussion about death of the author, authorial intent, and unintended mechanics. The two main schools of thought in cinema are auteur theory, where the creator is God and anything they say goes. The other is death of the author, where no matter what the author has said, the conclusions someone comes to are just as valid. I have issues with both, like J.K. Rowling using Twitter to claim Dumbledore is gay, rather than doing any work for LGBTQ representation. And it's clear that she has no actual interest in representation as she's expressed transphobic beliefs. And I also have issues with people who'll take any piece of media and argue for or against it, to slot it into a political narrative like people claiming Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk is bad because it's a metaphor for Brexit that supports the toxic, isolationist belief. Both do have merit and are important to the discussion of any work, but David Lynch put it best when he said that 100 years after a piece of work is published, the author is not there to hold your hand and guide you through the work to tell you what it means. But that doesn't absolve creators of mistakes or features of their work. In the web series Extra Credits, they describe unintended mechanics as aspects of a work that can unintentionally create a viewpoint or narrative in ways that are not thought about by the creators. Do I think William Friedkin or William Peter Blatty intended to create a horror film with an anti-countercultural message? I'm honestly not sure. I'm not familiar enough with the late William Peter Blatty's work or character to make any kind of assessment. I only know that The Exorcist book was based on a real-life event about a supposedly possessed young boy that many modern experts believe was acting for attention. So I do wonder why he made Reagan a girl compared to the real-life event. Friedkin's filmography doesn't give much insight either, as he's made everything from cruising that equated the homosexual community to murderers, to The Haunted and Bug, which have anti-military themes. It's nearly impossible to read or ask if either had any message or intention with the characterization and dynamics. This gets into my final part of the film. For the first half of the film, we experience it through Reagan's mother, Chris, and her struggle to help her daughter. But the second half turns to focus on Damien, an ex-boxer who is a priest that has slowly been losing his faith. The ultimate narrative and framing of the story is that Damien must use Reagan's possession, and thus her suffering as a means to redeem his faith, right before he becomes a martyr. The film ultimately uses religious iconography and faith to almost scare the audiences into belief. On the one hand, scaring an audience is something a horror film is supposed to do, but there's a line. The film does not discuss the theme of faith as much as enforce it. The cinematography often does not come off as examination, but rather emotional manipulation. And not the manipulation in a David Lynch film wherein our emotions are pushed to catch us off guard. The Exorcist, by metric of its language, framing, and characters, feels like it's trying to scare those who turn to counterculture or turn to medical science back into the gates of religion. Believe or suffer, it seems to say. The film isn't The Shining that talks about trauma and the toxicity of repressing it. It isn't Alien that explores rape, body horror, and fear of the unknown. And it isn't Halloween that discusses collective fears in the wake of Charles Manson's reign of terror. The Exorcist really wants to push the horrors that can happen to those who lose faith, and that only in faith will you be safe. Then again, what is it to say about a film where I've pretty much never seen that argument? The film received mixed reviews and was controversial due to the religious context and exaggerated reactions. The film received negative press from the very religious and was absorbed by the counterculture as a controversial horror masterpiece. Now we come to the why. Why did I make this? Aside from a long burning desire to talk about the film, I think it's important to have discussions about works typically considered masterpieces, even if it's removing the halo. I think it's important to have discussions about works typically considered masterpieces, even if it's removing the halo. Now, I don't want it to devolve into a hipster, this is popular, therefore it's bad argument. That discussion leads to dead ends, and considering I enjoy both mainstream and indie horror, that was not the issue with The Exorcist. I think it's important to consider that not everything considered classics have to hold on to it. For example, at the 71st Academy Awards, Saving Private Ryan lost Best Picture to Shakespeare in Love. Considering Saving Private Ryan is still well regarded in general consensus and spoken highly from a filmmaking and action point of view, while Shakespeare in Love is far less regarded or even seen, it shows that a work seemingly deemed of praise doesn't necessarily deserve it. In fact, a 2015 poll found that if counted again, Saving Private Ryan would have won Best Picture. There is value to be discussed in the failings of acclaimed work. I think one of the best examples is Lily Orchard's Steven Universe is Garbage video, link in the description, that thoroughly breaks down issues in production, management, intent versus execution, representation, and unintended mechanics practically ruining a story. And this video was hit back by people who thoroughly loved Steven Universe as it was a popular show and well regarded by many. The arguments made in that video and in this one aren't designed to force you to believe something, but make you question the content you watch and the lessons that can be learned from it. I didn't make this essay because I wanted to convince people to hate The Exorcist or call to ban problematic works. I wanted to have a discussion on why it's okay for classic works to be reappraised or possibly lose that arbitrary title. I also wanted to educate people on films, the language of storytelling, and what a work can mean by design or happenstance. I'd love to hear your thoughts on The Exorcist and what this 6-page analysis had made you think of it. Is there a book, film, game, show, or other media piece that you think deserves a reappraisal for the issues it has? And what's your overall opinion on the concept of removing media pieces from pedestals? Thank you for watching, everyone. See ya!